Hello and welcome to another Intro to Programming and Database tutorial. In this week we will going to be exploring the modularization. But before we go ahead and look at how you go about modularizing the code, let's first understand what modularization is. Now, one of the things to understand about modularization is an idea to break up complex tasks into smaller, more manageable tasks. So you're pretty much dividing a more complex task into smaller, more manageable tasks where each task is dedicated towards doing one thing. For example, if you have to do a chair assembly or a table assembly or any kind of a furniture assembly, you don't go for all the pieces at once. You rather divide up your task into smaller, more manageable tasks, and then you go about following directions, and the end result is a chair assembly. Similarly, in a work environment, it's not a one-man show. You pretty much designate the job to different individuals. Each individual then further divides up their job in a daily fashion, and all these individuals are managed by somebody, and all these managers are then managed by the managers above them, and this is how you build the hierarchy. So that's exactly how we do the modularization. Another example could be when you are completing weekly activities in this class. You do not go for everything in one shot. You probably may do your reading, maybe watching your YouTube video tutorials, and then go about also participating in the discussion boards. And then when you master some of the skill sets, now you start attempting your assignments. And towards the end of the week, you probably may be ready to go ahead with the quiz for that particular week. So these are some of the ways that you can go about modularizing your daily life, and we take the same approach when we are modularizing the code. So far, all the codes that we have written have been unmodularized. So what does that mean is we have been working only with one module, especially in a console-based application called the main module. So this is pretty much how we have been writing our code. We have been putting everything in the main. So main is one big entity which is controlling everything. This is an unmodularized design. So now we're going to take an example of a college. So if everything is placed in one big main module about a college, it's going to be a little bit difficult to manage if the length of the code is very long. But of course, for the purpose of this class and to make you understand the concept, I will going to be using less lines of code, because the idea is to teach you how to modularize the code and what are the benefits of modularizing the code. So now let's look at, if we modularize this code, we probably may end up creating some modules which will be controlled and maintained and managed by main. So we have a module that is about college information. We have a module that only tells us about the campuses. And then there is a module that tells us about the technology centers. So we took the logic out of the main, which was about everything, and divided it up into smaller, more manageable components. One only to tell us about the college information, one only to tell about the campuses, and one only to tell about the centers. And all of these entities will be called by the main. So in this particular case, when main, being the main module, calls all other modules, becomes the caller module, and all other modules become the called modules. By the word module in this particular context, I'm going to slightly change the word for the Visual Basic. We're going to be creating sub-procedures. That's a better terminology to be used in Visual Basic. So these are all sub-procedures. We have a main sub-procedure, we have a college info sub-procedure, we have a campuses sub-procedure, and we have a center sub-procedure. So centers, campuses, and college info will be called by main. And main, we're going to pretty much go about working with them. It's not like you have never seen a module getting called before. Whenever you write system.console.writeLine, so writeLine is actually in module. How do you identify if it's a module? Module always has a set of parentheses right next to its name. For example, this is a typical syntax of a module. When you write a module, sub, followed by the module name, followed by an opening and closing parentheses. Then there is a body of the module, just like we have an if and if, we have a sub and sub. And the module that you have coded this far is the main. And this is a typical example when you start your console application. You see sub, followed by the word main, followed by the parentheses, followed by end sub. And then you write your entire program logic between sub main and end sub. This is basically the core of what we call procedure-oriented programming. In a procedure-oriented programming, you take up your big task and divide it up into smaller, more manageable tasks, and you basically build this hierarchical structure of modules calling each other to do the job. So here I would now like to share with you an example of the actual code which we probably might have written in the past, maybe during weeks 1 and 2. Very easy, very simple code. And here's the code. Now in this code you can pretty easily see that we have a main sub procedure, and the main sub procedure has a word sub and sub, followed by the name main, followed by the parentheses. Now this procedure is required, this sub procedure is required by the VB console application because it always looks for this procedure called main. If this sub procedure or procedure main is not found, then it will not going to let you run the console application. Now if you notice here, inside this main sub procedure, I have several lines of code. I have lines about the college information, I have lines about the campus information, I have line about the center's information. Now some of this information is made up, for example, the number of employees. So just for the sake of this example. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the same design that I shared with you earlier on in the PowerPoint, and this is currently how my main module looks like, and we would like to divide it up into 3 separate modules, move some pieces of code around in these respective modules, and call these modules from the main. So in order to make this happen, we will going to first of all declare some modules. So we have a module called college info. So that's one module. Then we're going to create another one called sub campuses. So we have another one called campuses. And the last sub procedure is centers. So this pretty much accomplishes what we wanted to do according to this design. So main, we're going to be calling 3 sub procedures: college info, campuses, and centers. Now we're going to start moving the lines from the main into these respective sub-procedures. So these 2 lines are pretty much about college information. So I'll cut them. So I'm using Control-X, the keyboard shortcut. Otherwise you can do it from the edit menu. And I'm pasting it using Control-V in the college info. So these 2 lines go in college info. Then I get these 3 lines which are for campuses. I'll cut them and paste them under campuses. And then I cut my lines about centers and paste them in centers. So now I have this distribution going on for my code where all the lines that belong to college info are in the college info sub-procedure, all the lines that belong to campuses are in the campuses sub-procedure, and all the lines that belong to the centers is in the centers sub-procedure. Now I need to be able to execute the final information, which is main being able to call each one of them in the same order that it was before, so the output will be seamless. So now in the main, I need to make those 3 calls. This is how a module calls another module, simply by putting its name followed by the parentheses. So variables do not have parentheses in front of them, and the sub-procedures do. The reason sub-procedures do, because if one procedure wants to pass any value into the body of another sub-procedure, these values are passed and received within these parentheses. You're going to be seeing examples of those in the future example. However, for now, we are creating sub-procedures that will call other sub-procedures and we're not going to pass any values in between. Here's the call to campuses, and here's the call to centers. So here, main is pretty much calling the other sub-procedures in sequence, and other sub-procedures, whenever they get called, they will going to display what they're supposed to display. Behind the scene, all the sub-procedures work like a stack. For example, if you have ever looked at the stack of trays, the item that is at the top of the stack of the trays is the item that if anybody wants to get is the first tray that they snatch out of the stack. So here, this is how it works behind the scene. So when the program starts, the main subprocedure is at the top of the stack. Then main makes a call to college info subprocedure. So now what happens is main is pushed down the stack and college info comes at the top of the stack. Then the program displays Gateway Technical College on the console, number of employees 750 on the console. When the subprocedure ends, now the college info is thrown off the stack. The control returns back to the line where the college info call was made, so the main is now back up at the top of the stack. Then main makes a call to campuses. So when main makes a call to campuses, now campuses comes up the stack, displays the 3 lines on the console that is supposed to display. At the end sub, campuses goes off the stack, and the control returns back to main on the line from where the call was made. Then the centers gets called. When the centers gets called, once again, centers comes up the stack. Then the center does what it is supposed to do. At the end of the subprocedure, the control returns back to main. And then when it says end sub, main ends. And this is where when you are just simply running by pressing F5, your window comes and goes because main runs and it just disappears. When you use Control F5 or start without debugging, then what it does after the main is off the stack, it still gives you a snapshot of the console window before the main exit. So here, if I run my program the way it is right now, Control F5 is basically what I'm using, and here is my output. By looking at the output, you can't really tell that if the code behind the scene was modularized. And this is exactly the same output if I would have unmodularized the code. One of the benefits of modularization, it makes your job a little bit more manageable by breaking things down by names. So it's a little bit more manageable as you can see the names and you can tell, oh, okay, so this is the purpose of this code and this is the purpose of this code. And if you ever have to make any changes, since you know by name this is the place where things are controlled, you can pretty much go to that location and make changes. So if I ever want to change the number of employees that work for this college, I can simply go to this subprocedure called college info and I can change the number of employees to a different account. If I have more campuses opening for this college, I can go to the campuses procedure and make that change. If I have any of the new centers opening, then I can go to the center subprocedure and make the changes over there. So when I make changes in the individual subprocedures, when the call is initiated, those changes will be reflected in the output. For example, here if I decide to change the number of employees to 950. So now when I run this, after the change, you can see that the change is reflected. Now we have 950 employees. So that's one of the things that you can do with the help of modularization, that you can pretty much control your job into smaller chunks, more manageable chunks. There are other benefits to using this. For example, the flexibility of the code, the maintenance of the code becomes a little bit easier, and then the code reusability tremendously increases. For example, if you have to accept from user 5 scores, that will going to require from you 10 different lines of code. That means 1 line for the prompt and 1 line for the input. 1 line for the prompt, 1 line for the input. 10 lines of code just to accept 5 scores from user. But if I modularize that code and I create a module or a subprocedure, the job of that subprocedure is to accept an input from user, then I'm going to just put those 2 lines in that subprocedure and simply call it 5 times. Every time I need to take a score from user, I just simply call that subprocedure. So things become much easier when you start putting things in subprocedures or functions. Functions we're going to be dealing with next week, but this week we'll simply be dealing with how do you go about modularizing your code by introducing subprocedures, and how do you go about passing values to subprocedures. Hope you would have enjoyed this tutorial. Catch you in the next one. Thank you for watching.